As I pick up from where we left off, I think I marked a stop point. Recent archaeological discoveries in Iraq, in the ancient city of Babylon, they had discovered a clay cylinder with the names of Aramaic of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, listed them as a high-ranking official under Nebuchadnezzar's time. It's interesting that as you go back into archaeology, as you go back into history, even today they're finding stuff that tells us about what Daniel has been writing about. And who wrote the book of Daniel? Daniel, without a doubt. Daniel will mention the high name of God, El Elyon, 13 times, and as being sovereign over the governments of the nations. So as we look at our history going forward, and we see all the turmoil in Europe, the Middle East, and of course in America, God is in control of all those things. And God will give, as we see in Ephesians, God gave Paul the power to be that witness, to be that testimony. And I think in the times in which we live, as individuals, God's same power is the same. Never changes. The power that God gave Paul is the same power that when we come against the evil in this world as we go forward in life, He will be there to give us that same power and grace. Daniel will say 5 times that he touched me. Daniel 8:18, let's read that. And the best thing in life is when God touches you. Because even in my own life, I can look back now and see where God protected me. And when He touched me, He made me whole. When He touched me, He healed me. When He touched me, He gave me words to speak. When He touched me, He changed my life to be more like Him. So we should never be afraid of God touching us. Daniel 8:18. Now while He was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But He touched me and made me stand upright. And He said, "Behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end." So Daniel was touched because God wanted him to see something. How often in our lives when we get up in the morning, it sounds crazy, but I already know what my day will be like, because when I spend time in the morning, I just get this feeling that when I get to work, it's just going to be a horrible day. And I would say 9 chances out of 10, he's right. So, but that's when you pull on the full armor and you go to work and you do what you have to do. I know my week was a pretty tough week this week, but I know God was there. Daniel 9:21-22. He has touched and granted skill. All right, so let's turn to Daniel chapter 9. Verses 21-22. While I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. He instructed me and said to me, "Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding." So again, God, Daniel, gave him skill and understanding. 2 great gifts that God can give us in any situation in life. We need that skill and understanding. Daniel chapter 10, verses 10 through 11. He was raised up and stood on his feet. A hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. He said, Daniel, you are highly esteemed. Consider carefully the words I'm about to speak to you, and stand up, for I have now been sent to you. And when he said this to me, I stood up, trembling. Sometimes when we are faced with circumstances, we need the strength and the power, and sometimes we want to shrink back because we just are afraid. But there are times when God just comes to us, says, stand on your feet, stand up. Daniel chapter 10, verse 16. Daniel received strength. While he was saying this to me, I bowed with my face toward the ground and was speechless. The one who looked like a man touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and began to speak. I said to the one standing before me, I am overcome with anguish because of the vision, my Lord, and I feel very weak. So again, God touched Daniel, not only made to stand on his feet, granted skill and wisdom to see something, but God empowered him to have the strength, even though you feel faint, to receive that strength. And of course, God offers strength. I'm trying to think of the verse that just came to mind. There is no temptation taken you such as common to man, that he will not provide a way of escape. So sometimes in our life we need, God will show us something that is right, the right thing to do. But sometimes you say, oh, I don't know if I could do it. Make a stand for this or make a stand for that, or make that statement. Always being careful of our words which we speak. But Daniel 10:18 received strength. And again, the one who looked like a man touched me and gave me the strength. God will always give you the strength to do things that you never thought you could do in life. And you've always heard it said that in a moment of crises, like if you're in a situation and somebody gets trapped under a car, there's just something, even the smallest human being possible could run over, lift that car with immeasurable strength to free that person. Where does that power come from? Medically, I don't know, but just to be able to lift something up in an emergency, it must be adrenaline or something in our body. And again, God has that same power in our lives spiritually when we face the many trials that will come our way. Daniel is to the Old Testament as John the Apostle is to the New Testament. John, the beloved apostle, he leaned on the breast of Jesus, and also John the Revelator. 3 times Daniel in this book will be called thou beloved man. It brings to memory something that I would like to be called when I stand before God at judgment. But those words, thou beloved man, I'm sure we won't hear, but well done, good and faithful servant. So 3 times Daniel in the book, thou beloved man, the one who is loved, and 3 times the angels tell him that. So Daniel is an interesting man. We will get to know him personally more than any other prophet in the Old Testament. It's interesting that people know your character and the content of your character when they see you live your life. So often we live one life in church, and our lives change when we leave that foyer. And that's not where the Christianity should be. We should be living the Christianity in the world, bringing it here for strength, for learning, for fellowship, for encouragement, for power, for praise, and then be reinvigorated to go back out to live your Christianity in your job, in your neighborhood, with your friends. So we'll get to know Daniel very personal. We'll also know the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar, the only pagan king that gets the most written about in the Old Testament. Prophesied by Ezekiel and Jeremiah before he comes onto the scene. Imagine that. It just boggles my mind. And I guess we can equate this to our own life, that there's a lot written about Nebuchadnezzar even before it happened. You're talking about a couple hundred years the prophets wrote that Nebuchadnezzar would rise in his life. But in Psalms it tells us the same thing, that even before our days were counted or numbered, God knew who we were, what our purpose was, and we had, it's so neat to know that even before today, God knew. Before I was born, we can't conceive that. Before I was born, he knew exactly where we all be today. Nebuchadnezzar is called a servant of the Lord in Jeremiah. Not that he was a believer, but was used by God as an instrument or vessel to bring about God's plan. God can use anything in our lives. He can use non-Christians, he can use terrible bosses, he could use situations in our life to move us on, never to hold us back, but to move us on. It doesn't have to be a Christian for God to use. So Nebuchadnezzar, as it is spoke of in Jeremiah, was an instrument that God used in this particular situation that Daniel writes about. God used Nebuchadnezzar to bring about God's plan for Daniel's life. Jeremiah 27, 4 through 8. Give them a message for their masters and say, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. And usually when God says something, we should listen. Tell this to your masters, with my great power and outstretched arm, I made the earth, and its people, and the animals that are on it. And I give it to anyone I please. And we think that when we go to the voting booth, we cast our vote, that we make the choice. So even though I don't know who to vote for this year, I believe God will put the right person in. It may not be the one I like, but I think God has everything under control. Now I will give all of your countries into the hands of my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I will make even the wild animals subject to him. All nations will serve him and his son and his grandson until the time for his land comes. Then many nations and great kings will subjugate him. If, however, any nation or kingdom will not serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, or declare or bow its neck under his yoke, I will punish that nation with the sword, famine, and plague, declares the Lord, until I destroy it by his hand. So those are Jeremiah's very powerful words. They came true. Very interesting that God is in control of our whole world. And he set Nebuchadnezzar up for such a time as this. All right, let's get into the book of Daniel, finally, the first chapter. And like I said, we're going to go through verse by verse, and then we're going to come probably next week and talk about some of the insights and have maybe a few moments of discussion at the end of what some of the things that you've learned from the in-depth study. Again, it's spiritual living in a secular world, something that I should have learned when I was 21 years old, and I'm just learning it now at 64. So, verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So here Nebuchadnezzar's already started to fulfill what Jeremiah had talked about back in Jeremiah 27, verses 4 to 8. Nebuchadnezzar became king in 605 BC, besieged Jerusalem and took Jerusalem's wisest men. Daniel was born during Josiah's reign. 2 Kings 22 to 23 talks about that. He grew up under the king's reforms. And Daniel is very well aware of Jeremiah. And if you look at Jeremiah, chapter 9, verse 2, Oh, that I had in the desert a wayfarer's lodging place, that I might leave my people and go for them. That's not the verse I was looking for. Jeremiah, that's what I wrote down, quoted, 9:2. For all of them are adulterers, an assembly of treacherous men. Obviously, I don't know where I picked that up from. Anyway, back in Jeremiah, Daniel grew up under the teaching of Jeremiah in 609 BC. Verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his god, little g, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his god, little g. I make a point of that because he was taking the treasures from God's temple, thinking that the treasures that he was stealing, so to speak, and putting it in his temple, little g, thinking that that was going to bring power and prestige and make his little g something more powerful than they thought. So now Daniel's writing this, and it's interesting that Daniel didn't say it this way. And the Lord allowed them to take. Doesn't say take. Daniel knew that the powers of God was in control of history, and God gave them the treasures, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar. So he didn't come in and say, okay, this is mine. God said, here, I'm giving it to you. Not taking anything. We sometimes think that when we receive something or we take it, no, God has permission to give you things. They don't belong to you, they belong to God. And Daniel knew that. He knew his God, he knew his Lord. And he didn't say that they stole. God gave. Certain times, God allows his work to suffer. So you say, well, why would God give permission to come destroy the temple and take what belongs to God and put it in your own little temple of your own little God. Certain times God allows his work to suffer. Babylonians took worship articles to the temple of one of their gods. Their god was called Bel, also called Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonians. So I'm sure when they sacked the temples, the remainder of the people that were left, that weren't taken to Babylon, probably felt very discouraged. They felt a loss. They felt disheartened, like, how could God allow our temple to be stolen from? But they need to know that God is in control. The Lord gave, they did not take. We often feel in our life that God keeps us from something that we know we should have. It's funny how, as humans, we feel that way. We often feel God keeps us good things from us, or takes stuff from us. Like, why would God take this away from me, or not allow me to have this? This is so good for me. And how many situations in our personal life can we look at that and say, oh God, why did you take that from me? Or keep that from me? It would have been perfect. I could have taken that job in California and look where I'd be. But that job wasn't for me. I'm here. I would have picked Hawaii. I don't know why I would pick California. But Isaiah chapter 39, verse 7 says this. Again, what's very interesting is that whenever we read Scripture and we want to know a direction that God is leading us, we should always check Scripture to Scripture, because it really sheds a light on the direction of your life. And some of your sons who shall issue from you, whom you shall beget, shall be taken away, and they shall become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon. This prophecy was given 200 years before it actually happened. It's very interesting that God's word is so timely, so on point. And even had the description that it would become officials in the palace. And where did Daniel end up? An official in the palace, one of the most powerful men, next to Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 3, Josephus tells us that the 4 young men carried away to Babylon were princes and from the royal family. And Nebuchadnezzar had castrated them because he wouldn't want the wise, intelligent, good-looking men and leaders around his court and give them an opportunity to further their genetic line and inherit his throne. Very selfish of him, wasn't it, for Nebuchadnezzar? So the king ordered in verse 3, Asaphat, the chief of his officials, and other translations, it gives the right word, eunuchs, chief of the eunuchs. And this translation, New American Standard, I'm having people use New American Standard. I know Barbara and I do. Actually, I have to say this was my first Bible when I got saved. So this is 40-some years old, and for my birthday, my wife at 64 gave me a brand new Bible to use. So this one's kind of well-worn, and now I get to use that one as well. And that happens to be an NIV. So it gives me two different reads. So they became servants in the king's court. And there were no worries that his position as king or had to worry about if there was any takeover of his throne and his destiny. Nebuchadnezzar was always concerned, well, we as individuals are always concerned about our destiny, right? How many lose sleep and wonder what will happen after you're gone?
Don't care.
No, you don't care. Nebuchadnezzar, the big dream that's coming up in chapter 2 that we're going to study, lost sleep. He was robbed of sleep because he was worried what would happen after he was gone. Would he be poisoned by his wife in the coffee in the morning? Would he be attacked or overthrown by outsiders? And he lost sleep over it. We shouldn't be losing. I lose a lot of sleep over worries too, different kinds. Because Nebuchadnezzar didn't have to worry about money, didn't have to worry about anything. Everything was taken care of. He had more. In his lifetime, he had more wealth than the richest men today. I mean, he had tables with 6 foot long tables with 6 foot depth of gold, solid gold, at his disposal. But he was worried what would become of him after. At night. So verses 3 and 4. So then the king ordered Aspenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving the king's court. And he ordered them to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Going forward, we'll learn about some of those things about the Chaldeans. So that's when Daniel learned Aramaic. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to the master of eunuchs to bring them in. And usually when they say children, they don't say, I'm not thinking of 0 to 10 or 11. They always zeroed in on the ages of 10 to 18 because they're the most formidable at that age. James Dobson, I guess years ago, always thought that the most valuable age where you could teach and have the most effect on the youth would be the ages 14 to 18. But our society has become so complex that 14 to 18 really isn't enough time to form the affairs or the thinking or the mindset of kids. The new age today is junior high. So everything that you see in the stores, everything you see on TV is focused on that particular age group. So it starts when they're junior high and takes them through not only, it used to be high school, but now, I'm trying to think of how many years, probably the last 25, 30 years, that same mindset has now crept into the university. So now, the government has our kids from junior high all the way up through now college or university. And the trend over the last, again, I'm not sure how many years, and you can probably enlighten me, probably the last 20 years, maybe 15 to 20, now parents who work 2 jobs has a place where now they can take their 0 to, well, not 0 because they're not born yet, from 1 to 4 years old to a place, not only just to babysit, but you can have them being taught stuff. So, and it just really goes back that far. That's our society in which we live. So Nebuchadnezzar was looking for children 10 to 18, no blemish, well-favored, ability to stand in the king's court, to teach them the literature and the language of the Babylonians. So they want them to be very well indoctrinated. And that's what we kind of have today as well in school. Interesting that these 4 young men already demonstrated aptitude. They also were disciplined. And not only that, they all had character traits before they got to Babylon. They had integrity, and they knew where they stood with their God. And I think that's where we have to end.